Chances are, if you've just started using a dedicated camera, you've probably stuck to one of the automatic modes on that camera. And that's great if you just want to get a picture and not worry about any settings or anything like that. But if you want to start taking more control over your images, you're going to want to switch into either a manual or a semi-manual mode, like aperture priority or shutter priority. While I won't be going over those modes in this video, what we will be talking about is the three main exposure settings you want to worry about when you're in an automatic mode. Those are shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. Once you switch your camera into the manual mode, you're going to see a lot of numbers and settings on the back of your camera's LCD. We can eliminate most of these just for now and worry about the top three on the very top row of the LCD on the camera. What I have here is a Canon 80D, and across the top you're going to see first the shutter speed of your camera represented as a fraction, the aperture of your lens represented as usually a number and a decimal point, and then the ISO of your camera, or the sensitivity of your sensor to light. So let's take a closer look at that shutter speed. Represented as a fraction, the shutter speed of your camera is the amount of time that the shutter right in front of the sensor lets light hit that sensor and then close again. So right now we're looking at my camera and the shutter speed is 1/160th of a second. That means that for 1/160th of a second, that shutter opens and closes and allows light to hit the sensor. Next is aperture. Aperture is an f-stop value represented on the back of your camera and is lens specific. That means for every different lens you attach to your camera, you're going to have different aperture values available to you. This is because the aperture is located within your lens. It's multiple metal blades arranged in a circle that can either open up or close down to increase or decrease the amount of light that passes through your lens. If you have a point and shoot camera, chances are you're not going to be able to change the lens on the front of that camera, which means that the aperture values you have to shoot with will always be the same. If you have a DSLR or a mirrorless camera, you most likely can change the lenses on that camera, and by extension, the different f-stop values you're available to shoot at. Each lens has two important aperture values, its minimum aperture and its maximum aperture. The minimum aperture is how far that lens can close down and stop light from passing through it. That will usually be represented as a high f-stop value, like 18 or 22. The other number you want to look out for is its maximum aperture. So that's how wide the aperture of your lens can open up to allow the most light to pass through. This will be represented as a low f number, like f2.8 or f1.4. Last is ISO. ISO is represented as a whole number on the back of your camera. ISO is the sensitivity of your camera's sensor to light. On most cameras, ISO 100 is its base ISO, which means that the sensor is not boosting the amount of light or sensitivity that it's receiving. On the high end, usually around 6400, that means your camera is significantly boosting the amount of sensitivity that your sensor is using. So now that we understand these three settings, how do we use them? Say that I have an indoor scene and I want to take a picture of my cat. First, I'm going to want to open up the aperture of my lens as wide as possible so that I can get the most light coming through that lens and hitting that sensor. Next, I'm going to want to set the shutter speed to a value that allows the most light to hit the sensor, but not so much that I'm going to start to see camera shake in the final picture. And finally, for the ISO, we'll just leave it at 100 to start with and see what we need to do afterwards to brighten up the image if we need to do so. So we can see that the image we just took was too dark. So how do we fix this? Well, our aperture is already at its widest opening, which means that it can't allow any more light to pass through the lens. And our shutter speed is set to a value that it allows a lot of light to hit the sensor, but not so much that our shaky hands of the camera will start to show up in that image. That means that the only value we can change is ISO. So what we're going to do is we're going to put the ISO up to maybe 400 or 800 and see what that gives us in a final image. So now that we have an understanding of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture, get out there, start using manual, and see how creative you can get with these new different settings.